The smell reached them before the gates did. Not the rot they had prepared themselves for, not the sour odour of overcrowded barracks, or the metallic scent of fear that had followed them across half a continent, but something warmer. Wood smoke. Coffee, maybe. Wet earth thawing beneath the last stubborn crusts of snow. One of the younger Germans lifted his head slightly inside the truck, his cracked lips parting as if he had mistaken the smell for a memory. Nobody spoke at first. The truck groaned through the muddy road, canvas flaps rattling in the cold April wind, while pale morning light spread weakly across the pine trees lining the camp perimeter. The prisoners sat shoulder to shoulder in silence, wrapped in old coats that no longer belonged to countries so much as exhausted bodies. Someone coughed into a sleeve. Someone else muttered a prayer under his breath, quickly enough that it almost sounded accidental. They had surrendered 3 days earlier near the Rhine, though surrender itself had felt less like a decision and more like a slow collapsing inward, like a roof finally giving way under too much snow. Since then, rumour had become their only currency. Some said the Americans were soft, others said that was exactly what made them dangerous. One old corporal near the back insisted they would be shipped to mines in Canada where winter never ended. Another claimed Americans shot prisoners who hesitated during commands because they feared hidden weapons. Nobody knew anything. That was the worst part. Uncertainty made cowards of intelligent men. The truck slowed. Through a tear in the canvas, Carl caught sight of fencing ahead, tall wire fences glistening with frost, guard towers. Barracks painted dark against the pale sky. His stomach tightened immediately. There it was, the shape of captivity, familiar, ugly, unavoidable. Yet something about it felt strangely unfinished, almost temporary, as though the camp had been assembled by farmers rather than soldiers. Near the entrance, an American guard stood holding a steaming tin cup in both hands. He was laughing at something another soldier had said. Laughing. The sound drifted through the cold air with unsettling softness. Franz noticed it too. "They laugh too much," he whispered. Karl glanced at him. Franz had once been a schoolteacher in Hamburg before the war had reduced him into this narrow-eyed man who distrusted warmth more than cruelty. "Maybe they won already," Karl said quietly. Franz looked away without answering. The gates opened. The truck rolled forward. Gravel crackled beneath the tires. The men instinctively straightened themselves, shoulders tightening as guards approached. Orders came in English first, then broken German. Slow movements. Leave bags behind. Step down carefully. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody struck them with rifle butts when one prisoner stumbled climbing down from the truck. Instead, an American soldier, broad-faced and barely older than 19, reached out instinctively to steady him, before immediately withdrawing his hand again, embarrassed by the gesture. The prisoner stared at him in confusion. "Move," another guard said, though even that sounded tired rather than cruel. They were led across the compound in rows of 5. Boots sank slightly into wet dirt. Somewhere nearby, a radio played faint swing music, distorted by static. Beyond one barrack, Karl noticed smoke rising from a kitchen chimney. He could smell onions cooking. The scent hit him so suddenly, it almost hurt. For one disorienting second, he was back inside his mother's apartment in Cologne before the bombings, standing near the stove while rain tapped gently against windows that no longer existed. He lowered his eyes quickly. Memory had become dangerous these past years. Inside the processing hall, they waited beneath dim, hanging lamps, while American clerks wrote names onto papers. The room buzzed quietly with exhaustion. A young prisoner, no older than 16, stood trembling beside Carl, fingers blue from cold. The boy kept staring at the guards, as though expecting violence to erupt at any moment. It was the anticipation itself that exhausted them most. Human beings, Carl thought suddenly, could survive almost anything except endless waiting for pain. An older German officer, farther down the line, finally snapped under the silence. "What is this place?" he demanded in broken English. "A camp," the American clerk replied without looking up. "Obviously," the officer muttered bitterly. The clerk paused then, raising tired eyes toward him. "War's almost over," he said simply. "That's what this place is." Nobody answered. That night, the prisoners lay inside wooden barracks, listening to rain strike the roof in uneven rhythms. The bunks were narrow but clean. There were blankets. Actual blankets, thin, military-issued, rough against the skin, but clean enough to smell faintly of soap. Franz kept examining his suspiciously, rubbing fabric between his fingers like a man expecting hidden needles. "Don't trust this," he whispered into darkness. "Trust what?" Carl asked. Franz hesitated. Rain drummed overhead. "Anything easy." Nearby, someone laughed quietly at that. Just one breath of laughter before silence returned. Later, after lights out, Carl heard soft crying somewhere in the barracks. Not loud, not dramatic, the muffled sound of someone trying not to be heard. Nobody moved to comfort him, perhaps because nobody knew how anymore. Morning arrived pale and cold. Steam drifted above the camp kitchen as prisoners lined up for breakfast beneath a sky the colour of worn paper. Tin trays clattered softly. An American cook spooned eggs onto plates, while another handed out bread thick enough to require 2 hands. The Germans approached cautiously, almost ceremonially, as though generosity itself might be a trick designed to humiliate them. Carl accepted his tray with numb fingers. The bread was still warm. He stared at it for several seconds before eating. Franz leaned close beside him. "There has to be a reason." Carl chewed slowly. "For bread? For kindness?" Carl looked across the yard. An American guard stood smoking near the fence, staring absent-mindedly toward distant trees glowing pale with morning frost. He did not look triumphant, only tired, terribly tired. "Maybe they're tired too," Carl said. Franz gave a dry laugh. "That would be the first honest thing about this war." Days settled into uneasy rhythm. Roll call, meals, work details repairing fences or unloading supply crates. The camp sat beside a broad field where patches of snow slowly surrendered to spring mud. Beyond the outer fence stretched pine forests, trembling softly in evening wind. At dusk the sky turned silver behind the watchtowers, and for brief moments the entire camp seemed suspended outside history itself, detached from nations and speeches and maps. Just men breathing cold air beneath fading light. Suspicion remained. It lingered in every exchanged glance, every hesitant interaction between prisoners and guards. The Germans studied the Americans constantly, searching for hidden cruelty the way starving men searched for crumbs. Yet the cruelty rarely came. A guard gave cigarettes to an older prisoner with shaking hands. Another translated a letter aloud for a homesick teenager who could barely read. Once, during heavy rain, an American sergeant allowed exhausted prisoners to shelter early inside a supply shed rather than remain standing outside in formation. Small things, tiny fractures in expectation. And somehow, those were harder to understand than brutality would have been. One afternoon, Carl and several others were assigned to unload crates beside a recreation field near the southern fence. The field itself looked absurdly normal. Flat dirt, wooden benches, white chalk lines half erased by rain. Nearby, a group of American soldiers tossed a baseball lazily back and forth while waiting for instructions. The prisoners ignored them at first. Then one of the Americans overthrew the ball. It rolled across wet ground and stopped near Carl's boots. Instinctively, he bent to pick it up. The leather felt strange in his hand, smooth, carefully stitched. A child's object, somehow surviving inside war. The American nearest him grinned and gestured casually. "Throw it." Carl hesitated. Franz stiffened immediately beside him. The guards nearby watched with mild curiosity, but no alarm. Finally, Carl tossed the ball back awkwardly. It bounced short. A few Americans laughed, not cruelly. One shouted something teasing. Another mimed a better throwing motion. Carl found himself almost smiling despite himself. Almost. The moment passed quickly, yet something invisible shifted afterward. That evening, the prisoners spoke about it in hushed voices inside the barracks. "They play games while Europe burns," one man muttered bitterly. Another shrugged. "Maybe that's why they won." Franz sat silent for a long while before speaking softly into darkness. "A civilization can be measured," he said, "by what it does when it no longer has to be afraid." Nobody responded, but the sentence remained hanging there long after the lamps dimmed. A week later, the gloves appeared. No warning, no ceremony, just a stack of worn baseball gloves carried into the yard by an American corporal with freckles and permanently rolled sleeves. Prisoners gathered cautiously around the fence, while guards distributed them alongside old bats and faded baseballs. Confusion spread immediately. One German lieutenant narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "What is this?" The corporal shrugged. "Game." "Why?" The corporal considered the question seriously. Then he answered with surprising honesty. "Because everybody keeps staring at the fences." Some prisoners refused outright. Others accepted reluctantly, as if touching the gloves might somehow betray the dead. Carl stood motionless while a glove was pressed into his hands. The leather was old and cracked near the thumb. Someone had written initials inside it years earlier, American initials, perhaps belonging to a boy now buried somewhere across the ocean. He slipped the glove on awkwardly. It smelled of dust and summer. For several moments nobody moved. The field remained silent, except for distant wind moving through trees. Then the young prisoner from processing day stepped forward, nervously holding a baseball. "How do you play?" he asked. One of the American soldiers barked out a laugh. "Badly," he said. Even Franz smiled at that. The first game was terrible. Men ran in wrong directions, caught balls with their bare chests, swung too early or too late. Americans shouted instructions while prisoners argued in German about rules none of them understood. Mud splashed everywhere. Somebody tore a sleeve diving for a ball he missed completely. And yet, gradually, laughter began appearing in strange places around the field, tentative at first, then fuller, warmer, escaping men who looked afterward almost ashamed of themselves. Carl noticed something unsettling while standing near second base. For several minutes he had forgotten the war entirely, forgotten surrender, forgotten cities turned to rubble, forgotten uniforms and borders and speeches. There had only been cold air in his lungs and the sound of voices rising together beneath a pale afternoon sky. The realization frightened him more than captivity ever had. That night he sat alone outside the barracks, watching steam rise from the camp kitchen into blue evening light. Snow melt dripped steadily from rooftops. Somewhere nearby, Americans and Germans together were still arguing about baseball rules. Franz approached quietly and sat beside him without speaking for a while. "Do you know what bothers me most?" Franz finally asked. Carl shook his head. Franz stared toward the fences. "I don't know what to do with this." "With what?" "The possibility," Franz said slowly, "that hatred is easier than understanding." The wind shifted gently through pine trees. From somewhere beyond the barracks came the sharp crack of a baseball hitting wood, followed by scattered cheering. Small sounds, ordinary sounds, the kind that once belonged to another world. Spring deepened around the camp. Mud gave way to grass. The trees beyond the fences darkened into richer green, and warmer air carried the scent of damp earth through open barrack windows at night. The prisoners began sleeping more heavily now. Some even dreamed again, though dreams remained dangerous territory. Carl often woke before dawn, listening to the soft breathing around him, the occasional cough, the distant footsteps of guards changing shift beneath fading stars. There was something profoundly strange about hearing ordinary life continue in the middle of history's collapse. The war had trained them to expect extremes, terror, rage, spectacle, but captivity here unfolded through quieter contradictions. A guard lending a prisoner a newspaper, a medic treating an infected hand without contempt, a baseball game interrupted because someone had spotted deer grazing calmly near the outer fence. The men did not know how to process such moments. Cruelty had structure. Kindness felt shapeless. One rainy afternoon, the prisoners were gathered inside a storage hall while storms hammered against the roof hard enough to shake dust from the beams overhead. The Americans allowed smoking indoors because the weather was miserable. Men sat on crates or leaned against walls beneath dim yellow lamps, wrapped in coats still damp from work details. Someone had found a harmonica. A slow tune drifted through the room, fragile as smoke. Carl watched an American guard standing near the entrance. The guard looked exhausted, his eyes hollowed by months of war. Water dripped steadily from the brim of his cap. He could not have been older than 23. The harmonica stopped. Silence settled again. Then the guard spoke unexpectedly in rough German. "I had a brother," he said. The room shifted slightly. Nobody interrupted him. "Killed in Ardennes." He rubbed tired fingers against his forehead before continuing. "He liked baseball too." That was all. He said nothing else. But the sentence lingered heavily in the stale air afterward. Not accusation, not forgiveness, just fact. A human detail offered carefully between enemies, like a candle shielded from wind. Later that evening, France spoke quietly while staring at rain sliding down the windows. "Maybe war survives," he murmured, "because men only learn each other's names afterward." Karl said nothing. Outside, thunder rolled beyond distant tree lines, while lantern light flickered softly across wet ground. The camp no longer felt entirely like a prison, yet it did not feel like freedom either. Something stranger existed in between, a place where enemies slowly became witnesses to one another's exhaustion. Days later, word spread through the barracks that Germany had officially surrendered. The announcement arrived without ceremony. An officer read translated notices while prisoners stood motionless beneath grey skies. No cheering came from the Germans, no dramatic collapse. Only silence. Deep, stunned silence. Some men lowered their heads. Others stared blankly toward the fences, as if trying to imagine a country that no longer existed in the form they understood. Karl felt oddly empty. He had imagined this moment often during the war, but reality arrived drained of triumph or catastrophe. Just exhaustion. Endless exhaustion. An American guard nearby removed his helmet and ran fingers through flattened hair. "Guess it's over," he muttered quietly to another soldier. But even he sounded uncertain. Over. Such a fragile word for so much ruin. That evening, the camp remained strangely subdued. No baseball games, no arguments. Men sat outside the barracks beneath fading light while evening mist crept across the field. Somewhere, a radio played distant jazz. Karl watched smoke rise from cigarette tips, glowing briefly in darkness like small drifting embers. Franz sat beside him, wrapped in a blanket. "What happens now?" Karl asked. Franz smiled faintly. "Now we discover whether peace is harder than war." Near the fence, the young prisoner, who had first asked how to play baseball, stood tossing a ball absent-mindedly into the air and catching it again. Up, down, up, down. The rhythm seemed almost hypnotic against the quiet evening. An American corporal approached, carrying 2 extra gloves tucked beneath one arm. He paused awkwardly before holding them out. "Double game tomorrow," he said. "Need more players." The young prisoner accepted the gloves carefully, like something fragile. "Why?" he asked after a moment. The corporal looked toward the darkening field. "Because tomorrow exists," he answered simply. That night, Karl could not sleep. He stepped outside sometime before dawn. The camp rested beneath silver moonlight, fences casting long, narrow shadows across wet earth. Everything seemed softer at that hour, less certain. He walked slowly toward the recreation field, where rainwater still glimmered faintly in the dirt. A forgotten baseball lay near home plate. He picked it up. The leather felt cold and slightly damp beneath his fingers. For reasons he could not fully explain, his throat tightened suddenly. Not because of the ball itself, because of what it represented. A thing made for leisure, surviving among ruins. An object created not to wound or defend, but simply to pass harmlessly between human hands. Behind him, footsteps approached quietly. It was the older American sergeant who had once allowed prisoners shelter during rain. The sergeant nodded toward the ball. Can't sleep? Carl shook his head. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Pine trees whispered softly beyond the fences. Finally, the sergeant said, "Funny thing about camps." Carl glanced at him. "What?" The sergeant looked out across the empty field. "You spend enough time guarding people." He paused briefly. "Eventually, you start seeing faces instead of uniforms." The sentence settled deeply into Carl, though neither man acknowledged it afterward. The sergeant lit a cigarette. Smoke curled upward into pale moonlight. Somewhere, far away, an owl called through the trees. Small sounds again. Always the small sounds surviving history. Summer arrived gradually. The prisoners grew thinner from waiting, but less haunted from fear. Baseball games became routine now, though still clumsy. Americans and Germans mixed teams sometimes. Arguments over rules dissolved into laughter more often than anger. One afternoon, France surprised everyone by hitting a clean line drive into the outfield before calmly adjusting his glasses as though nothing remarkable had happened. Even he laughed when the others cheered. "A miracle," Carl told him afterward. Franz shrugged. "No," he said dryly. "Poor pitching." Yet beneath the humour, something fragile had begun taking shape inside the camp. Not friendship exactly. The wounds remained too fresh for such easy language. Too many dead stood invisibly between these men. But there was recognition now. Shared fatigue, shared hunger, shared awareness that survival itself carried uncomfortable obligations. The Americans were no longer faceless victors. The Germans no longer faceless enemies. History had reduced them first into symbols and then, slowly, painfully, back into people. One evening after a game, Carl sat near the fence watching sunset stain the clouds pale gold above distant forests. A baseball glove rested beside him in the grass. Nearby, several prisoners spoke quietly about home. Not politics, not battles, just kitchens, sisters, dogs, trains. Tiny ordinary things reclaimed carefully from memory, like photographs rescued from rubble. The young prisoner approached carrying 2 cups of coffee stolen from the kitchen. He handed one silently to Carl before sitting beside him. Steam drifted upward between them into cooling air. "Do you think they'll remember us?" the boy asked suddenly. Carl considered the question for a long while. Beyond the fences, crickets had begun singing softly in the dark grass. "No," he said finally. The boy looked disappointed. Then Carl continued, "But maybe they'll remember this." "This?" Carl glanced toward the empty baseball field, toward the barracks glowing warmly beneath evening lamps, toward guards and prisoners moving through dusk, no longer entirely certain who was supposed to hate whom. The moment they stopped. The boy followed his gaze silently. Somewhere in the camp, laughter rose briefly into the night before fading again. Gentle, human, temporary. Years later, Carl would struggle to explain the camp to people who wanted simpler stories. They asked about cruelty because cruelty made sense to them. They asked about punishments, starvation, hatred. They wanted captivity to resemble the shape they already carried in their minds. And yes, there had been fear, shame, hunger, endless uncertainty. But what haunted him most was not brutality. It was the memory of standing inside a prison camp, holding a baseball glove, while an enemy patiently taught him how to throw. Because the gesture had forced something unbearable into existence. Complexity. The war had trained everyone to think in absolutes: good nations, evil nations, monsters, heroes. Yet memory resisted such neat arrangements. Human beings always leaked through the cracks somehow. In the smell of coffee, in shared exhaustion, in the awkward kindness of young soldiers too tired to keep hating correctly. Sometimes Karl wondered whether civilization itself depended entirely upon such moments. Small refusals, tiny interruptions in the machinery of cruelty. A hand steadying a prisoner who stumbled from a truck. A blanket that smelled faintly of soap. A baseball crossing quietly through cold evening air between former enemies. The world liked to remember wars through explosions and speeches because those were loud enough to survive history. But real change often arrived softly, through gestures so small they almost disappeared while happening. Years afterward, whenever Karl smelled fresh-cut grass or worn leather warming beneath summer sun, he found himself back beside those fences again, hearing distant laughter drift across the field beneath pale American skies. Not because the camp had erased the war. Nothing could erase it. Too much sorrow remained buried beneath Europe for that. But for one brief season, inside a place built to separate human beings from one another, men had accidentally remembered something older than ideology. That no uniform could fully conceal a face forever. And perhaps that was why the memory endured so stubbornly, because in the end, the thing that unsettled him most was not how easily human beings learned to hate. History had already answered that question many times over. It was how unexpectedly, how inconveniently humanity kept returning anyway. 1. Black and white, high-contrast image of exhausted German POWs sitting tightly packed inside a dark military truck at dawn, cold breath visible in the air, anxious human faces illuminated by weak light through torn canvas. Cinematic wartime realism, emotional tension, 16:9. 2. Black and white, high-contrast image of German prisoners stepping through an American POW camp gate, surrounded by wet fences and guard towers. One young American soldier quietly helping a stumbling prisoner. Strong emotional contrast, muddy ground, expressive faces, documentary realism, 16:9. Black and white, high-contrast image of German POWs silently receiving warm food in a camp kitchen line, steam rising from metal trays, tired faces lit by soft overhead light, atmosphere of suspicion mixed with fragile relief, cinematic realism, 16:9. Black and white high-contrast image of confused German prisoners standing on a muddy baseball field, while American soldiers hand them worn baseball gloves, fences and pine trees in background, emotional expressions of disbelief and hesitation, cinematic documentary style, 16:9. Black and white high-contrast image of German POWs and American soldiers awkwardly playing baseball together in wet spring mud. Blurred motion, laughter breaking tension, intense human expressions, fences visible behind them, emotional realism, 16:9. Black and white, high-contrast image of Karl sitting alone near the empty baseball field at night, holding a worn baseball glove, moonlight casting long shadows from fences, quiet, reflective atmosphere, emotional cinematic realism, 16:9. 7. Black and white, high-contrast image of former German POWs and American guards standing together at sunset near the baseball field after the war announcement. Faces filled with exhaustion, uncertainty, and fragile humanity. Soft light behind pine trees, deeply emotional documentary realism. 16:9.